At 18, Caleb Marsh had $31, a duffel bag, and nobody in the world expecting him to survive the summer. His stepfather had locked the house the morning after his mother's funeral and told him through the window that the arrangement was over. Caleb took the bag off the porch and walked. He spent 6 weeks in a shelter in Dellard, Missouri, picking up day labor when it came and saving every dollar he didn't spend on food. When the county tax auction listed a collapsed ice house on the edge of town, condemned, no utilities assessed at $40, starting bid 6, he raised his hand. Nobody else did. For $6, Caleb Marsh owned a building. But 3 weeks later, when he worked a flagstone loose from the drainage channel in the floor, the one sealed with old mortar in the coolest corner of the ice house, he found something Walter Prout had placed there before Caleb was born, something no one in Dellard knew existed, sealed in the floor of a building the county had been trying to get rid of for 11 years. His mother's name was Sharon. She had been 41 years old and had died on a Tuesday in late June from a stroke that the doctors said nobody could have predicted, which was probably true and also beside the point. She was there on Monday and gone on Tuesday, and the world that had organized itself around her, small, imperfect but real, came apart without ceremony on Wednesday when Caleb's stepfather, Dennis, told him through the bedroom window that the lease was in his name alone and the house was going to his sister, and Caleb had until morning. Dennis was not a violent man. He was something harder to name than violent, indifferent, the way a road is indifferent to what it goes through. He had married Sharon when Caleb was 11, and for 7 years Caleb had lived in Dennis's house on Dennis's terms, and the terms had never been hostile exactly, just absent. Dennis went to work and came home and watched television and paid the bills. He did not talk to Caleb about anything that mattered. He did not come to Caleb's games or his graduation, not because he was cruel but because it simply didn't occur to him that he should. Sharon had been the reason the house felt like a home. And when she died, there was no more reason. Caleb took his duffel from under the bed and packed what fit. His clothes, a jackknife his grandfather had given him before the grandfather died, a photograph of his mother from a birthday 3 years ago. She was laughing at something off camera, the kind of laugh that came from somewhere real. He packed the photograph carefully between a folded shirt and his extra pair of socks. He left everything else. His books, the little fishing gear he'd accumulated, the school certificates on the wall of the room he'd slept in for 7 years. He left them not because they didn't matter, but because carrying them would have made the leaving feel permanent in a way he wasn't ready for yet. He walked out at 6 in the morning with the bag over his shoulder and $37 in his pocket, 3 weeks of saved wages from a landscaping job that had ended when the season did. The shelter in Dellard was a converted Baptist fellowship hall on Clement Street, run by a woman named Mrs. Ochoa, who had the particular calm of someone who had seen too much to be surprised by any of it. She gave Caleb a cot near the window and a laminated card with the meal schedule and told him the rules, which were few and reasonable. He stayed 6 weeks. He slept badly for the first 2 and adequately after that. He picked up day labor 3 or 4 mornings a week, hauling brush, pouring concrete footings, loading pallets at a lumber yard east of town. He ate 2 meals a day and walked everywhere to save gas money. He did not call Dennis and Dennis did not call him. He thought about his mother every day. He thought about her the way you think about something you didn't understand while you had it and are now trying to reconstruct from memory, going back through ordinary afternoons, ordinary conversations, looking for the shape of her. She had worked the front desk at a dental office for 15 years. She had liked crossword puzzles and bad weather and the smell of coffee before it was ready to drink. She had told Caleb once, when he was maybe 13, and having a bad week of the kind that 13-year-olds have, that the main thing was just to keep going. Not because things got better automatically, she said. Just because keeping going was the one thing you could always do. He kept going. He saved the day labor money. He spent carefully. He ate the shelter meals without complaint and thanked Mrs. Ochoa every evening in a way that embarrassed him but felt right. By the end of the first month, he had $42 saved above his food costs. By the end of the second, he had 61. Then the notice appeared on the community board in the shelter's front hallway. A single printed sheet, official county letterhead. Annual tax lien auction, DELLARD County Courthouse, Saturday, August 14th. A list of properties with their assessments and starting bids. Most of them were empty lots or residential parcels with amounts Caleb couldn't approach. But near the bottom of the list, between a vacant trailer and a commercial storage unit, was an entry that stopped him. Parcel 714C structure, former commercial ice house, approx. 900 SQ, FT, collapsed roof section, no utilities. Assessment, $40. Starting bid, $6, no reserve. He read it 3 times. He didn't know what an ice house was exactly. He knew what the word meant, a place where ice was stored before refrigeration, the kind of thing you found in old towns. He didn't know what one looked like from the inside, or whether a collapsed roof could be repaired, or what you did with 900 square feet of commercial space in a town the size of Dellard if you managed to acquire it. He was 18 years old and had $31 and a duffel bag on a cot in a shelter. He went to the auction on Saturday. He arrived early and stood at the back of the small crowd on the courthouse steps. Most of the bidders were older men in work clothes and a few in suits, investors and locals and 1 or 2 curious onlookers. An auctioneer moved through the list briskly, parcels falling in 30 seconds to a minute. The vacant trailer went for $40. The storage unit went for $300 to a man in a white truck. Parcel 714C came up near the end. The auctioneer read the description in the flat recitative of someone who had read it before. Former commercial ice house, collapsed roof, no utilities, assessment $40. Nobody raised a hand at $6. The auctioneer looked out at the crowd. He raised an eyebrow, a theatrical pause. Caleb raised his hand. The gavel came down. He paid $6 in crumpled bills at a folding table and received a deed receipt and a set of directions to parcel 714C from the county clerk's assistant, who gave him a look that was either sympathy or curiosity. He couldn't tell which. He walked to the address that afternoon. It was on the south edge of Dellard, where the town thinned into cedar lots and gravel roads, 2 blocks past the hardware store on Prater Street. He found it by the smell before he found it by sight. A cool, faintly mineral smell that hung in the August heat like something left over from another season, rising from the earth itself beneath the wreckage. The ice house was a stone building, 1 story, built from the same dark limestone that the Ozarks pushed up through the soil everywhere you dug. The walls were standing on 3 sides, solid and thick, the stones laid with a precision that spoke of someone who had taken the building seriously when he built it. The 4th wall, the north face, had buckled where a cedar tree had grown into the foundation over the years and finally heaved the corner loose. The roof, what remained of it, sagged into the interior from one side, sheets of rusted corrugated metal folded down over the stone walls like something exhausted. Around the base of the building, the weeds had grown to chest height. Pokeweed and sumac and the thick, stubborn vines of wild grape, all of it fighting for the strip of moisture that seeped from the building's foundation in the August heat. Caleb pushed through it and found the door, a heavy wooden door with iron strap hinges, swollen in its frame but not locked. He put his shoulder against it and shoved. It opened. The inside was dark and cool, several degrees cooler than the August afternoon outside, which in the Ozarks in mid-August was the kind of heat that sat on you. The coolness came from the stone itself, from the thickness of the walls and the earth-banked foundation, from whatever was beneath the building that kept the ground cold even in summer. He stood in the doorway and let his eyes adjust. The interior was 1 large room, roughly square, with a packed earth floor that had been laid over with flat flagstone at some point, most of it still intact, the stones settled into the earth over decades, fitted edge to edge with the tight precision of a man who measured twice. The collapsed roof section had brought debris into the northeast corner, cedar branches, leaves, 20 years of bird nests, rusted metal, but the rest of the floor was clear. The rest of the walls were sound. Along the south wall, a set of heavy wooden shelving was still bolted in place. The shelves sagged but held. On the lowest shelf, set neatly on a folded piece of burlap as if left there deliberately, were three objects. A pair of work gloves, leather stiff with age, the kind used for handling blocks of ice. A ledger navy blue thick, its cover worn smooth at the spine. And a folded piece of paper, tucked under the ledger's cover with a single word written on the outside in faded pencil. Notice. Caleb didn't touch them yet. He stood in the cool dark and looked at the room and let it register. The building was damaged but not destroyed. The walls were stone and they had been built to last. The floor was solid underfoot. He walked it carefully, testing, and it held. The shelving could be repaired. The collapsed roof section was the worst of it, but the rest of the roof, old corrugated metal on hand-hewn rafters, had held, and the rafters above the main floor looked sound from below. A man had worked in this room. For decades, from the feel of it, the ledger on the shelf, the gloves, the shelving built to hold weight. Someone had cared about this place when it was running. Someone had swept this floor and organized these shelves and set those objects down on the burlap as if he expected someone to come back for them. Caleb sat on the floor in the cool dark for a long time. Then he picked up the notice. It was typewritten on county letterhead, dated 11 years ago. It informed the owner of record, WALTERLPRUITT, that the property located at 14 Prater Street, Dellard County, had been cited for structural deficiency and assessed for county tax lien due to non-payment of property taxes since the owner's death. The notice was addressed to the estate of Walter Pruitt, which apparently had no executor, no heirs, and no one to pay the taxes. 11 years of non-payment at $40 a year. The county had been carrying the lien until the auction made it someone else's problem, Walter Pruitt. Caleb set the notice back under the ledger's cover. He picked up the gloves and held them. They were sized for a large man, broad-palmed, the leather shaped by years of use to the grip of hands Caleb had never seen. He set them down. He picked up the ledger and opened it. The handwriting was large and deliberate, the handwriting of a man who had not written for pleasure but had written carefully when he had to. The first entry was dated April 1952. Opened accounts today. Jasper Freeling, £40 per week for the butcher counter, paid in full. Holt Brothers Farm, £20 Tuesday and Friday for the milk cooler, paid on the 1st. Corley's Restaurant, as needed, run a tab. He turned to the second page. May 14, 1952. Took on the Dunham family, Harvey Dunham, 6 kids, farm out on Route 9. He needs £50 a week through September to keep the cellar cool enough for the vegetable store. He's short this month. Told him to start in June when the harvest money comes in. He said he'd send the boy to help haul. The boy is about 12 and works hard. Told Harvey his account is open. Page after page in the same deliberate hand. Names, quantities, amounts. The careful record of a man who kept ice in an age before refrigeration had reached every corner of the Ozarks and knew that the families he served depended on what he stored. Caleb read, standing in the doorway with the summer light coming in behind him, turning pages slowly. The entries were not just commercial. Walt Pruitt had noted when accounts ran behind and why: a family with a sick child, a farm with a failed crop, a restaurant that had a bad summer. He noted when he extended credit and for how long. He noted in brief shorthand what happened afterward. Dunham boy name is Carl, came 3 Saturdays in a row to help haul, good worker, never asked for anything. Told Harvey the fall account was clear. He brought a jar of honey in October. Set it on the shelf. Caleb looked at the shelf. In the corner where the jar would have been set, there was a pale ring in the wood, the circle left by decades of a jar sitting in one place. He read until the light outside shifted toward afternoon. He read about families he didn't know and farms that might not exist anymore, and the slow accumulation of 35 years of ice and credit, and the particular loyalty of people who remembered being helped when they needed it. And then he stopped at an entry near the back of the ledger, maybe 10 years before it ended, and stood very still. The entry was dated June of 1978. Sharon Heller, Father Howard, farm stand out on the county road. They've been using my ice since '74. This summer the drought cut their produce nearly to nothing. Howard came in looking like a man who'd been up 3 nights deciding whether to ask for something. I told him the account was open through September, no questions. He said he'd pay in the fall. He will. Caleb turned the page. July 15, 1978. Howard Heller brought Sharon in to help settle the account. He's teaching her the books early. She's 9 years old. She counted out the coins herself, went through her father's change purse careful as an auditor, came up $1.40 short. She looked at me like she was ready to argue about it. I told Howard the account was square. Sharon looked at me a long time after that like she was deciding something. Then she said thank you and meant it. She'll be all right, that one. Sharon Heller. Caleb's mother's maiden name had been Heller. He stood in the doorway of the ice house with the ledger in his hands and the August heat pressing against his back and the cool stone dark at his front, and he read the entry again. Sharon Heller, 9 years old, counting coins from her father's change purse. $1.40 short. A man who told her the account was square. His mother had been born in 1962. She would have been 9 years old in the summer of 1978. Her father, Caleb's grandfather, who had died before Caleb was born, had run a farm stand on a county road somewhere in this part of Missouri. He sat down on the flagstone floor. She had never mentioned Walt Prout. She had grown up 2 counties over and moved away at 19 and never talked much about the farm or her father's accounts or the particular kindnesses of strangers in a drought year. But here was her name. Here was her 9-year-old self counting coins. Caleb looked at the floor beneath his feet. The flagstone fitted tight, old, and in the coolest corner of the room, the corner where the earth stayed coldest, where the drainage channel ran from the old melt sluice to the south wall, a section of floor that looked slightly different from the rest. Not cracked or damaged, just different. The mortar between those stones was older than the mortar elsewhere, or perhaps newer, reapplied. He crouched down and ran his fingers along the seam. One flagstone shifted slightly under pressure, just slightly, as if it had been lifted and reset. He went and found a pry bar in the debris from the collapsed section. He came back and worked the pry bar into the seam. He didn't open it that afternoon. The bar found purchase and the stone moved, but he stopped himself. He set the bar down and sat back on his heels and looked at what was in front of him. There was something down there. He could feel the difference in the air, a slight release, like a breath held for years. Whatever was below that stone had been sealed for a long time. He thought about doing it alone in the fading light of an afternoon in a building he'd owned for 6 hours. He thought about doing it slowly. He set the pry bar against the wall and left the stone where it was. He picked up the ledger and the gloves and walked back out into the August heat. He needed someone who knew this building. He needed someone who had known Walter Prout. He went to the hardware store on Prater Street. The woman behind the counter was maybe 68, with the broad, easy competence of someone who has run the same business for a long time and knows where everything is without thinking about it. Her name, on a hand-lettered sign by the register, was Dora Pike, Pike Hardware, EST, 1979. She was cutting keys when Caleb came in, and she looked up without interrupting the motion. "You're the one who bought the Prout place," she said. It was not a question. "Word gets around," Caleb said. "This is Dellard." She set the key down and leaned on the counter. $6. Nobody else wanted it. Nobody else knew what to do with it. She looked at him with the steady, assessing look of a woman who has been reading people across a hardware counter for 40 years. "You're from the shelter." "I was. I needed somewhere to go." "And now you've got somewhere to go." She studied him a moment longer. Walt Prout built that ice house in 1951. Hand-laid stone every course. He ran it until 88 when the last of the farms that still needed him switched to electric coolers. She paused. He died in 2009. No family, kept to himself. Left the place locked up and the county let the taxes run. Did you know him? 30 years. He came in here every spring for mortar and fasteners and came in every fall for whatever he'd put off all summer. Bought the same things in the same amounts. Never asked for advice he hadn't already thought through. She looked at the ledger under Caleb's arm. "Where'd you get that?" "It was on the shelf inside, along with his gloves." Dora was quiet for a moment. "He left things on that shelf deliberately. I know because he told me once that everything worth finding was already in the right place." She looked at Caleb steadily. "What are you going to do with the building?" "Fix the roof. Live there, I think. I don't have anywhere else." She looked at him a long time. Then she reached under the counter and came up with a paper bag, the kind used for lunch, folded at the top. She set it on the counter. "I make extra biscuits on Tuesdays," she said. "I'll bring them by. You'll need coffee too. I have a camp percolator in the back that was somebody's returned item. Consider it a loan." She reached into her coat pocket and produced a key on a ring with a worn leather tab. "Walt gave me a spare key to the building in 2007, couple years before he died. Said he wanted someone nearby to have it in case of what I asked him." She set the key on the counter beside the biscuits. "He said in case someone needed to get in." Caleb picked up the key. It was an old skeleton key, heavy, the kind made to last a century. "He never said someone like you specifically," Dora said. "But I've been holding that key for 11 years and you're the first person who's come asking, so I think this is what he meant." He went back to the ice house. He had the key, which fit the lock he hadn't known existed, a second lock on the interior face of the door, bolted from within, that secured to a bracket Walt had set into the stone wall. He didn't know yet why the building had an interior lock. He would learn later. He swept the debris from the main floor with a broom from the hardware store and laid his sleeping bag near the south wall, where the temperature was cool and even, the stone giving off its stored cold into the air. He lay down on the floor of a building he owned for $6 and looked up at the rafters and listened to the Ozarks' dark come in through the gaps in the old roof. He was 18 years old. He kept going. In the morning, Dora was at the door with biscuits and the camp percolator and a coil of extension cord to run power from the hardware store's exterior outlet, which she said she'd been meaning to install a proper line from for years. She looked at the interior of the ice house with the quick, thorough assessment of someone familiar with it. "That corner section is the problem," she said, meaning the collapsed northeast wall and roof. "The rest of the structure is sound. Walt built with 12-inch stone on a rubble footing. Those walls will outlast both of us." "What did the interior lock?" Caleb asked. Dora looked at the bracket on the wall. "In the early days before the town had reliable electricity, the ice house was the most important cold storage between here and 2 counties in either direction. In July and August, people would try to break in and take ice. Walt installed the interior lock so he could sleep in here on hot nights and nobody could get in." She looked around the room, at the shelving and the floor. "He slept in here almost every summer for the first 10 years, said it was cooler than his house." She handed Caleb a biscuit and looked at the ledger on the shelf. "He told me once," she said, "that the thing about the ice business was that everyone needed it and almost nobody could pay full price in summer, which was exactly when they needed it most. He said he had 2 choices, charge full price and watch people's food go bad or keep accounts and trust that things balanced out over time." She broke her own biscuit. "He believed in the long account, things settle if you give them time." "There are entries going back to the 1950s, Caleb said. He wrote everything down." "My mother's family is in there." Dora stopped. "Sharon Heller," Caleb said. 1978, her father Howard, the drought year. Walt kept their account open." Dora set her biscuit down on the shelf and turned to look at him fully. Her expression was careful and still, the expression of someone being careful with something that might be fragile. "Your mother's maiden name was Heller," she said slowly. "Yes. She grew up near here, 2 counties over. She moved away at 19. She died in June." Dora looked at the flagstone floor, at the walls, at the shelving where the honey jar had left its ring. "Walt never told me about the Heller family," she said. "He had hundreds of accounts. He didn't talk about them by name." She paused. "But he told me once that he believed every act of generosity connected to something you couldn't see from where you were standing. He said he kept the ledger because he wanted the record to exist even if he never saw how it came out." She looked at Caleb. "I think he believed the record would find the right person eventually." Caleb looked at the flagstone in the corner. "There's something under the floor," he said. Dora looked at him steadily, then she said, "Then let's go look." The pry bar was where he'd left it. He worked the stone loose carefully, Dora holding the lantern she'd brought from the hardware store. The flagstone came free with the same mineral exhale he'd felt the afternoon before, a breath of cool, still air from beneath. Below the stone was a cavity, perhaps 18 inches deep, lined with the same cut limestone as the walls. Dry. Walt had built it dry and sealed it dry, and it had stayed that way through however many summers and winters had passed over this floor. Inside the cavity, wrapped in oilcloth tied with wax string, a metal document box, rectangular with a rotating latch. And beside it, a glass jar with a sealed lid and a rubber gasket, the kind used for canning. Inside the jar, folded paper, a letter. Caleb could see the handwriting through the glass, and beneath the paper, filling the bottom of the jar, something that caught the lantern light in a way that made both of them stop. Coins. Old ones, the silver color of quarters and dimes, maybe 30 or 40 of them, loose in the bottom of the sealed jar. And among them, on top, a single folded piece of paper that was not a letter. Caleb unscrewed the lid carefully. He unfolded the paper. It was a receipt. Dated July 15, 1978. Heller account, 1 delivery ice, $1.40 credit applied. Account balance, 0. W. Prout. The $1.40 he'd forgiven Sharon Heller. He'd kept the receipt for 30 years and then put it in a jar in the floor. Dora was very still beside him. Caleb set the jar down carefully and picked up the document box. Inside, a ledger he hadn't seen before, smaller than the one on the shelf, with a different cover, brown leather, worn at the corners from being handled. And beneath it, a document in a plastic sleeve. A deed. 2 pages, official, with a county recorder's stamp. And beneath the deed, a savings passbook from a credit union in Dellard, dated 1988. The last entry showed a balance of $8,412, and then no further entries. Walt had stopped adding to it when he closed the ice house. He had left it sitting, accumulating interest, waiting. Caleb opened the brown ledger. The entries in this one were different, not commercial accounts, something else, shorter, more personal. The first entry, dated 1965, the Ozarks has a long memory. People remember who helped them in a dry summer 20 years later. They send their children in to pay an old account. They show up with produce from a garden and won't take no. I am not a wealthy man. I'm a man who is owed by a community that knows how to repay. That is not the same as money, but it is not nothing. He turned pages. The entries moved through the decades. 1972. Harvey Dunham's boy Carl works at the sawmill now. Came by last month to say thank you for the ice credit in 1952. I told him his father paid that account 20 years ago. He said his father told him to say thank you anyway. I think what Harvey meant was, thank you for not making a man ask twice. 1985, people ask me sometimes what I'll do when I close. The refrigerators have reached every farm. The restaurant switched over 2 summers ago. The Holtz retired. I'll close when it makes sense to close, and I'll leave the building for whoever comes next. This town needs its buildings to mean something. Empty buildings are just waiting. 1988, last season, closed the accounts, left the ledger on the shelf. Left the gloves, left the notice so whoever comes knows whose it was, then a gap of years, and near the back of the small brown ledger a series of entries from the early 2000s when Walt was in his 80s, 2003. I've been thinking about the spring parcel. The cold well on the back half-acre has been running clean since before I was born. A man from a water company offered me money for it last year. I told him no. That spring is the reason this building stayed cold for 40 summers. I'm not selling the reason. 2005. Set up the trust with Reuben at the county clerk's office. The deed to the spring parcel goes to whoever holds the ice house property and demonstrates intent to stay. Reuben says the language is unusual. I said I know what I mean. 2007. Gave Dora the key. She'll know what to do with it. 2009. This is probably the last entry. I have been thinking about what the ice business taught me. It taught me that the most important thing you can store is trust. Cold keeps food, trust keeps people. I kept both as long as I could. I hope whoever finds this knows what it was for. The last entry, no date, written in a shakier hand at the very bottom of the last page. If this finds a young person, the spring parcel deed is in the document box. The passbook is there too. The money is yours if you stay. The trust language is intent to occupy and maintain. That means you stay. Caleb turned the page. He expected that to be the last entry. It wasn't. Tucked inside the back cover of the small brown ledger, folded in thirds, was a letter. 2 pages of lined paper in Walt's careful handwriting, undated, the pen strokes heavier than in the ledger, the handwriting of a man concentrating. Whoever finds this, I don't know your name. I've tried to imagine you a few times and I can't get the picture right, so I've stopped trying. But I believe you're real. I believe someone will come. The ice house is stone. The foundation is rubble limestone on bedrock set in 1951. The walls are 12-inch course laid plumb. The roof will need work eventually, everything does, but the walls will stand. I want you to know that because some people look at a building that needs help and decide the whole thing is lost. It isn't. The bones are good. The spring in the back half-acre has been running since before anyone I know was alive. My father showed it to me when I was 8 and told me it was the oldest thing on the property, and that was probably true. I've never had it tested, but the water is clean and cold, and I have been drinking it for 70 years without complaint. A man offered me money for it once. I told him no. A spring is not a product, it's a reason. I kept accounts for 35 years. Some people paid, some couldn't. I kept them anyway because the ice kept food cold and food kept families fed, and that was the job. I don't think I did anything remarkable. I think I did what was in front of me, which is the same thing. What I want you to do is stay. Use the building for something the town needs. Keep the spring. Keep the account open, whatever that means for you. If people need something you can provide and they're short, trust that things balance over time. They do. Keep a record, not for your own sake. For the sake of whoever comes after you and finds it and needs to know that the place meant something. I don't know if any of this will find the right person. I think the Ozarks will sort it out. This country has a long memory and a way of putting things where they belong. W. Prout Caleb read the letter twice. Then he folded it along its original creases and held it in both hands. Dora had been quiet for a long time. She sat on her crate with her lantern and looked at the walls. "He wrote it for you," she said softly. "He didn't know it was you, but he wrote it for you." Caleb sat on the floor of Walter Prout's ice house in the Ozarks heat, surrounded by stone walls built to last 100 years, with a ledger in his hands that contained his mother's name in 1978 and a document box in his lap that contained a deed to a spring and $8,000 and the final written words of a man who had never known him. "Stay." He pressed his hands flat against the cool flagstone. "Here's where the story changes. Stay with me, because what Walt Prout left in that floor wasn't just for anyone. It was for Caleb." 3 weeks later, a letter arrived at the hardware store addressed to the owner of Parcel 714C. Dora brought it over in the morning with the biscuits. She set it on the shelf beside the old ledger and said nothing. Caleb opened it. The letter was from an attorney in Fayetteville, Arkansas. A man named Haverford, representing Sims Property Holdings, LLC. The letter was polite in the way that threatening letters are polite, all the courtesy on the surface and the threat underneath, like a hand in a white glove. It stated that Gerald Sims, through counsel, had identified an irregularity in the tax auction proceedings related to Parcel 714C. The irregularity, the letter explained, concerned the back half-acre, a separate recorded parcel, identified in county records as 714D, containing a registered spring easement. Attorney Haverford asserted that this parcel had been inadvertently included in the tax lien auction as part of the adjoining property without proper notice to interested parties, and that his client, who had previously filed a letter of interest with the county recorder regarding Parcel 714D, had a documented claim of right of first refusal on any forced sale of that parcel. In plain terms, Gerald Sims was saying that the spring didn't come with the ice house. He was saying that the auction was flawed. He was saying the spring was his. Caleb read the letter twice. Then he set it down. "How long has Sims been after the spring?" he asked. 3 years, Dora said. She poured coffee and leaned against the wall. "He runs a real estate holding company out of Fayetteville. He had a deal in 2021 with a regional water bottling operation. They were interested in the spring. But Walt's estate was in limbo and the county wouldn't negotiate a sale of a disputed parcel until the tax lien was resolved." She looked at the letter. "He thought the auction would solve it for him. He planned to bid on the parcel. But I bid first. He wasn't there. He sent a representative who arrived 20 minutes after the gavel came down." She looked at him. "He's been unhappy since Saturday." Can he do this? He can file. Whether he can win is different. She sat down on a crate. The trust language is specific. The deed to the spring parcel transfers to whoever holds the ice house property and demonstrates intent to occupy and maintain. Walt wrote that specifically to protect against someone coming in and flipping the ice house for the spring alone. She paused. You've been sleeping here for 3 weeks. You've repaired sections of the shelving. You've cleared the debris. You're living here. Intent to occupy and maintain. That's what it says. Caleb looked around the building. He had done more than sleep here. He had cleared the collapsed northeast section down to the wall and had gotten estimates from 2 contractors for the roof repair. He had contacted a utility company about running a line. He had swept and organized and fixed the shelving and set the flagstone carefully back into the floor after making a list of what was in the document box. He had opened a checking account at the Dellard Credit Union and transferred the passbook balance into it. He had, in 3 weeks, treated this building as if it were his to stay in, because it was. I need a lawyer, he said. I know one, Dora said. The attorney's name was Pauline Ostrander. She worked out of a 2-room office above the pharmacy on Main Street in Dellard, had been practicing county law for 30 years, and had the particular unimpressibility of someone who has seen every angle of a small county property dispute and has stopped being surprised by any of them. She wore reading glasses on a chain and drank coffee from a mug that said World's OKAYEST Attorney, which she had bought for herself deliberately. She read Haverford's letter in approximately 90 seconds. It's a nuisance claim with legs, she said. The legs are procedural. He's claiming the auction process was flawed. If he can demonstrate that the county clerk failed to give proper notice of the spring parcel's separate status, he might get a judge to look at the sale. She set the letter down. But here's the problem with his theory. She opened the document Caleb had brought, the deed from the box, with the trust language. She read the relevant section. Prout set up this trust specifically because he anticipated someone might try to separate the spring from the ice house. The trust language binds them. The spring parcel does not convey independently. It transfers with the ice house property to someone who meets the occupancy criteria. She looked at Caleb. Do you meet the criteria? I've been living here for 3 weeks. Do you have any evidence of that? Caleb thought. He had the shelter's records showing he'd left the day after the auction. He had the utility inquiry letter he'd mailed the week of the auction. He had a receipt from the hardware store for the broom, the extension cord, and the plaster mix materials for cleaning and repair. And he had Dora, who had been coming by every Tuesday with biscuits and had watched him work. I have evidence, he said. Pauline nodded. Then we have a case. His case has to show the auction was improper. Our case is that it doesn't matter, even if he gets the auction reviewed, the trust controls the spring parcel, and the trust requires occupancy. He doesn't have occupancy. You do. She took off her glasses and set them on the desk. There's something else. The trust document was recorded with the county clerk in 2005. That recording is public record. Sims has been trying to acquire this parcel for 3 years. Either his title search missed the trust document or he found it and is hoping a judge will find a way around it. She paused. Neither of those reflects well on him. When does he want a hearing? His letter requests a response within 20 days. I'll respond with a full title brief in the trust document. If he pushes to a hearing, we'll be ready. She picked up her coffee. In the meantime, keep living there, keep a record, receipt everything. Caleb went back to the ice house. He had been keeping a record since the first day, not formally, but the way Walt had kept records. A small notebook in his back pocket, the kind sold at the counter of every general store. He noted the date and what he'd done each day and what had been repaired and what still needed repair. He noted the names of the people who came by. He noted the biscuits. The biscuits had become a pattern. Dora came Tuesdays and Thursdays. By the second week, other people had started coming too. A man named Harlan, who had bought ice from Walt in the 1980s for his bait shop, came by one afternoon to see what was happening to the building. He stood outside for a while before he came in, the way people stand at the edge of something they're deciding about. When he finally came through the door, he moved through the room slowly, running one hand along the shelving, looking at the walls. Walt laid these stones himself, Harlan said. He wasn't speaking to Caleb exactly. He was speaking to the room. Every course took him 3 summers. He stopped at the section of wall where the mortar was new, where Caleb had filled the gaps. He studied it. Good work. Thank you. You do this before. No, Harlan grunted, which was apparently the highest form of approval he offered. He looked at the cleared debris pile outside the open door. You'll want to get the rest of that corner stabilized before you do the roof. The wall has to be plumb or the roof load will shift. I know. I've been reading about it. Harlan looked at him. I can show you where to set the bracing. I used to help Walt with repairs in the 80s. He said it the way people say something they'd been deciding whether to offer. Come by the bait shop tomorrow morning and I'll bring my levels. He looked at the shelf with the ledger and the gloves and the ring in the wood. Walt would be all right with this, he said, and then he left. A woman named Celia brought a casserole and her husband brought a load of cedar shingles, leftovers from a roofing job, in the bed of his truck. He stacked them against the south wall and said they'd been sitting in his barn and needed to be used. He didn't ask what Caleb planned to do with them. Caleb used them on the section of roof he'd been patching by hand. It wasn't a full repair, not yet, not until he had the money for the contractor, but it was something. Cedar smelled clean and sharp against the old iron smell of the roof. An older woman named Frances stopped in one afternoon and stood in the doorway for a long time. She had a paper bag that she set on the shelf. Inside were 2 mason jars of sweet tea and a note that said, "My daddy bought ice here every summer. He said Walt Prout was the most honest man in Delaware County, and that means something in a county that has its share of the other kind. Welcome." She was gone before Caleb could say thank you. By the end of the second week, the shelf had 2 jars of tea, a jar of honey from Dora's bees, a pound of coffee from Harlan, and a handwritten note from someone who didn't sign their name that said only, "Keep it." Caleb kept it. And 3 weeks into the work, the weather turned. It came on a Wednesday afternoon without much warning, the sky going from pale to green in the particular way that means trouble in the Ozarks. Caleb was on the roof when the light changed. He came down fast, pulling his tools from the repair section, and got inside just as the rain started. Heavy, not sideways, not a tornado sky, but a real August storm, the kind that means business. The north wall held. The south wall held. The east and west walls held. The northeast corner, the section he'd been working on but hadn't fully stabilized, did not hold. He heard it go. A grinding, slow collapse as the compromised section of rafter shifted in the wind load and the metal above it buckled and folded. Not the whole roof, not a catastrophic failure, but the repair he'd spent 2 weeks doing, the shoring and the shimming and the patient, slow work of building trust in old timbers, came down in about 15 seconds while he stood in the middle of the floor and watched. The sound of it settled. The rain came in through the new gap in sheets. Caleb stood in the middle of the flagstone floor in the rain coming through his own broken roof and looked at what was left of his 2 weeks of work. He stood there for a while. He thought about leaving. Not permanently, he wasn't going anywhere, but for the night at least. He could go to the shelter, explain, come back in the morning. He could call Dora. He didn't leave. He found the tarp he'd bought from the hardware store for exactly this possibility, and climbed back up to the remaining rafters and spread it over the gap, working in the rain, tying the corners to the rafter ends with paracord. It wasn't waterproof, not really, but it reduced the inflow from sheets to drips. He came back down soaking and sat on the flagstone floor and waited out the storm. When it cleared, the air smelled like wet cedar and red clay, and the particular mineral coldness that the ice house gave off after rain, sharper, cleaner, as if the water had rinsed something open. The gap in the roof let in a rectangle of stars. Caleb lay on his back on the flagstone and looked at them. His mother used to say that stars were just the light getting through. She said it on camping trips, the 2 of them in a tent in the woods, her pointing out constellations she knew and making up names for the ones she didn't. He had thought it was a practical observation. Looking up through the gap in Walt Prout's ice house roof, he understood it was also something else. The keeping going, the light finding the holes, the way things got through. He stayed. The contractor came the following week. A lean older man named Cutter who had been roofing in Delaware County since before Caleb was born. He walked the roof, came back down, and gave a number that was $800 less than the previous estimate. Walt Prout put these rafters in himself, Cutter said. White oak hand-hewn. I'm not going to charge full rate to repair something a man built that well. He looked at Caleb. You the one who bought it for $6? Yes, Cutter almost smiled. Good. The roof work took 4 days. Caleb worked alongside Cutter every hour, handing materials, holding braces, learning to read the geometry of the repair from a man who had done it so many times the math was in his hands. On the last day, when the final course of metal went on and Cutter ran a bead of sealant along the ridge, Caleb stood in the cleared interior and looked up at a roof that was whole. The ice house was sound. He opened the passbook savings for the contractor payment and the utility deposit and still had enough to cover 6 months of modest living if he was careful, which he had always been. The morning after Cutter finished, a Tuesday, Dora came with biscuits. She sat on the crate she'd claimed as her regular seat and looked at the ceiling and said, he'd approve of the rafters. Cutter said the same thing. Walt built things to outlast himself. She sipped her coffee. He told me once that the only honest thing a man can do with a building is build it better than he found it and leave it that way. Caleb thought about that. He had found this building with a collapsed corner and a sealed floor, and the records of 35 years of quiet generosity on a shelf. He didn't know yet what he'd do with it, what the ice house could become, whether anyone in Dellard still needed cold storage, or whether it would become something else entirely. He didn't know those things yet. But the roof was on. The floor was sound. The walls were original stone. He was going to figure out the rest. And then he found someone sleeping in the building. He'd come back late from an errand and found the door ajar, not broken, not forced, just ajar, the way it went when the latch didn't catch. Inside, in the storage corner near the south wall where the temperature was lowest and steadiest, a girl was asleep on a folded moving blanket, her backpack for a pillow, her jacket pulled over her shoulders. She woke fast when he came in, the same fast wake of someone used to being found somewhere she wasn't supposed to be. I'll go, she said immediately, already on her feet, already reaching for the backpack. It's 40 degrees in here, Caleb said. It's August outside. She stopped. She was 16, maybe, with the particular thin wariness of someone who had been navigating difficult situations for a while and had gotten good at reading rooms. Her name, she said when he asked, was Ruby Cole. She'd been staying with a relative that hadn't worked out. She didn't expand on what hadn't worked out, and Caleb didn't ask. I wasn't going to take anything, she said. I know. She looked around the ice house at the repaired shelving, the cleared floor, the new rafters visible through the roof. Did you fix this place? I'm fixing it. She looked at the shelf with the old ledger and the gloves and the worn circle where the honey jar had sat. What was it? Ice house. The man who owned it kept ice for the whole county for 30 years. Ruby sat back down on the moving blanket with her arms around her knees. She was trying to figure out what was happening, whether this was the part where she got told to leave again or whether it was something else. I need someone to help clean and organize this place, Caleb said. There's a storage room in back that I haven't gotten to yet, wages, and there's a cot. Ruby looked at him. Not charity, he said. Work. I'm serious about the wages. She looked at the floor. Then she looked at the shelf with the ledger. Then she looked at him with the expression of someone deciding whether to believe something that seems too reasonable to be safe. Okay, she said. The hearing was on a Thursday morning in October in the county courthouse in Dellard. The weather had broken into the dry, crystalline cool of an Ozarks fall, the hills going orange and bronze on the ridges, the cedar hollows still dark green below. Caleb drove himself in a used truck he'd bought for $400 from a man 2 streets over. It ran. That was the main requirement. Gerald Sims arrived in a rented SUV with attorney Haverford and a young associate who carried documents in a leather briefcase. Sims was in his 60s, prosperous-looking, with the contained impatience of a man who was accustomed to getting what he wanted after a reasonable number of steps. He had not expected the steps to include a 23-day delay in a hearing in Dellard County. The courtroom was small. The gallery held perhaps 20 people and most of the seats were taken. Dora was there. Harlan from the bait shop. Celia and her husband who had brought the cedar shingles. Cutter, the contractor in his good jacket which still had plaster dust on the sleeve. A man named Bernard who had driven in from 2 towns over. Caleb had only found out later that Bernard's family was in the ledger. 1961. A summer drought and 4 children, and a milk cooler that needed 40 pounds of ice a week. Pauline Ostrander sat at the respondent's table with a folder that was thin by any attorney's standard, because she didn't need much. At the back of the room, Ruby sat very straight in the last row, her hands folded, watching. The judge reviewed the filings for several minutes. He was a quiet man, older, with the deliberate pace of someone who had decided at some point not to be hurried. Haverford presented the procedural argument. The county auction had failed to give proper notice of the spring parcel's independent status. Therefore, the sale was potentially invalid as it related to parcel 714D. His client had a recorded letter of interest with the county and should have been separately notified. The judge looked at the county recorder's representative, who confirmed that the parcel had been included in the auction as part of the adjacent property per standard bundled lien procedure. The notice had been published as required. No separate notice had been issued for 714D because it was not separately liened. It was included in the bundled assessment. So the procedure was followed, the judge said. The recorder's representative confirmed it was. The judge turned to Pauline. Pauline set one document on the bench. The trust deed, recorded 2005. Walter Prout recorded this trust instrument with the county on March 14, 2005, she said. The instrument specifies that parcel 714D, the spring parcel, transfers as an appurtenant to parcel 714C, the ice house property, to any party who acquires the ice house through lawful means and demonstrates intent to occupy and maintain. She paused. This recording was public. It was available to any title search conducted in the past 18 years. The trust controls the disposition of the spring parcel regardless of the auction's notice procedure. The judge read the document. He read it a second time. Was this trust instrument disclosed in the auction materials? He asked the recorder. A brief, uncomfortable pause from the recorder's side. It had not been. The auction materials had listed the parcel as bundled, with no mention of the trust instrument recorded against it. That was a procedural omission, not fraud, but an omission. Haverford's associate whispered something to Haverford. Pauline said quietly, "The omission, if anything, strengthens the respondent's case. The trust was recorded. The trust was binding. The auction transferred the property. The trust's occupancy criteria are met." She set a second document on the bench, Caleb's notebook, photocopied, 37 days of dated entries, receipts from the hardware store, the utility inquiry letter, a signed statement from Dora Pike confirming continuous occupancy since August 15th. Intent to occupy and maintain is documented. The room was quiet. Sims sat at the plaintiff's table looking at the trust document on the judge's bench. Haverford was no longer writing. The young associate had stopped shuffling papers. The judge looked at Sims directly. "Counsel, your client had access to the public record of this trust instrument for 18 years. Can you explain why a title search was not conducted prior to submitting a letter of interest to the county recorder?" Haverford stood. He offered an explanation that covered several sentences without containing an answer. The judge set the document down. "The auction was procedurally valid," he said. "The trust instrument was lawfully recorded and controls the disposition of the spring parcel. The respondent has demonstrated occupancy as required by the trust's terms. The challenge is denied. Parcel 714D transfers to the respondent per the trust instrument of 2005. He looked at Caleb. "That spring belongs to you, son." The gavel came down. In the gallery, Cutter made a short, approving sound. Harlan nodded once. Dora sat with her hands folded and her eyes closed for a moment, the way people close their eyes when something they've been holding on to can finally be set down. At the back of the room, Ruby unclenched her hands. Outside, on the courthouse steps, Caleb stood in the October air and breathed. The hills were orange and bronze against a sky that was very clear. He could smell the cedar and the red clay, and somewhere, faintly, the cold mineral smell that he now recognized as the smell of the spring, the underground water that had kept the ice house cold for 70 years, still running, still giving. Pauline came out behind him and shook his hand. Walt wrote good trust language, she said. He wrote it for someone he'd never met. He wrote it for whoever came. She looked at the hills. In my experience, that's the best kind of trust. No conditions except the obvious ones. She walked to her car. Dora appeared at his elbow. Well, she said. Well, Caleb said, biscuits tomorrow. Yes. She walked to her truck and drove away. Caleb stood on the steps alone for a moment, watching the color on the hills, thinking about a man who had sealed a deed in a floor in 1988 and trusted the Ozarks to send the right person eventually. He drove home. The ice house opened in the spring. Not as an ice house. There was no market for that, and the refrigerator had settled the question of cold storage before Caleb was born. What it became was something he hadn't planned and wouldn't have predicted. A cold storage and preservation cooperative, serving the dozen or so small farms in the surrounding hollows that were growing specialty produce and needed cold chain storage between harvest and sale. The spring-fed cold well in the back half-acre, cleaned and lined and fitted with a modern pump, maintained the building at a temperature no electric system could replicate for the same cost. The farms needed somewhere cold and accessible. The ice house was cold. The math was simple in the way Walt had always found the math simple. Ruby ran the books. She was 17 by then, attending the Dellard High School on a schedule that accommodated the mornings she worked, and she had the same careful precision with numbers that Walt had described in a 9-year-old girl counting coins from her father's change purse. She did not like being owed, and she did not like owing, and she tracked the cooperative's accounts with an exactness that the farmers trusted immediately. Caleb repaired the rest of the interior over the winter. He rebuilt the shelving on the south wall to its original specifications. He'd found Walt's notes in the second ledger, the dimensions and the wood type in the hardware. He relayed the section of flagstone floor that had been disrupted and set the original stones back in their original positions. He left the corner section clear, the place where the cavity was, sealed again with its original stone, exactly as Walt had left it. He left the old ledger on the shelf. He left the gloves. He left the worn ring in the wood where the honey jar had been. Dora came on the opening day with biscuits and a jar of honey she'd made from hives she kept behind the hardware store. She set the jar on the shelf in the ring where the first jar had stood, and nobody said anything about it, and it was exactly right. The farmers came. The Hollow families came. Some of them were in the ledger, their grandparents' names, their parents' names in the careful handwriting of a man who believed that the long account settled if you gave it time. They walked through the ice house and looked at the original stone walls and the rebuilt shelving and the ledger under its plastic sleeve on the shelf, and some of them stopped to read it. Some of them found their family's name. Some of them didn't say anything. Some of them did. A man named Beaumont, whose grandfather's farm was in the ledger from 1959, a summer drought and a milk cooler, came in on the third day of operation with 2 jars of sorghum and set them on the shelf beside Dora's honey without explanation. The shelf began to fill. Harlan came in one afternoon in May and stood in the middle of the flagstone floor and looked up at the repaired rafters and the sound roof and the clean stone walls. He had the expression of a man looking at something he'd believed was gone. Walt would be all right with this, he said again. The same thing he'd said in August, looking at new mortar. But he meant something bigger now, and Caleb knew it. He called his mother's family in October. He had found them through the ledger. The Heller name had led him to a county over, to a cousin of his grandfather Howard who still farmed the same land and remembered Sharon as a girl. An older woman named Me who had been Howard Heller's younger sister, 83 now and sharp as her age would allow. She had cried when Caleb called. She had not known Sharon had a son, had not known Sharon had died, had been looking for any connection to Howard's family for years. She drove down in November to see the ice house. She stood in the doorway in the November cold and looked at the walls and the floor and the shelf with the ledger and the honey jars and the work gloves. She looked for a long time. She was a serious little girl, Me said. Your mother, she had your grandfather wrapped around her finger, but she never let on that she knew it. She counted every coin. She turned to look at Caleb. She'd be glad you're here. She told me to keep going, Caleb said. Me nodded. She would have. She touched the stone wall with one hand just briefly, the way you touch something you want to remember. Her daddy would have too. In the evenings, after the cooperative closed and Ruby had gone to do her schoolwork, and the farmers had all gone back up into the hollows, Caleb sat on the floor of the ice house in the cool quiet and wrote in a new notebook. He wrote the date and what had happened and who had come and what the accounts showed. He wrote the names of the farms and the amounts and the notes on what each family needed and why. He wrote it down the way Walt had written it down, because he believed the record mattered, because he believed it would find the right person eventually, because he was 22 years old and had a building and a spring and a notebook, and the sense that the long account was only beginning. He had $31 when he got here. He had not become wealthy. The cooperative covered its costs and paid Ruby's wages and was slowly building a reserve for repairs. He fixed the truck twice with his own hands and ate simply and spent carefully. He did not have much. He had the walls Walt built. He had the spring Walt protected. He had the record of the families Walt had kept, and he kept them now. He had Dora on Tuesdays and Thursdays. He had Ruby's careful handwriting in the accounts book. He had the honey jars accumulating on the shelf, each one left by someone whose family was in the ledger, each one a payment on a debt they didn't owe because Walt had already called it square. He had the cool mineral smell in the heat of summer, and the stars through the rafters on clear nights, and the sound of the spring running cold and clean in the back of the half-acre, running the way it had always run, the way it would go on running long after everyone here was gone. Some people leave you a door. Most of them don't live to see you walk through it. Walt Prout had built this one out of hand-cut limestone in 1951, sealed the key to it in trust, and waited 70 years for someone to find the door worth opening. Caleb had walked through. He closed the notebook and set it on the shelf beside the old ledger, the two of them together, Walt's handwriting and his own, the old account and the new one, the long record of what this building was for. He turned off the lantern. The ice house held its cold in the dark, the way it always had. EOF.